Certainly we realize that Moses is one of the most colorful and also, I think, important characters that we read about in the Bible. He was born in a time whenever Pharaoh had decreed that all the male babies that were born of the Israelites should be cast into the Nile River so that he could control the population of the Israelite men that were growing up. But we find that Moses, because of her love for him and also because of her bravery, his mother refused to do that. In fact, the Bible says that she hid him for 3 months at home. And whenever it became apparent that she couldn't hide him anymore, she made a little basket, the Bible calls it an ark, and she covered that so that it would be waterproof, and she hid it in the bulrushes in a place where Pharaoh's daughter was known to come and frequent to bathe and to spend time with some of her maiden servants. And of course we realize that by God's providence, Pharaoh's daughter found little Moses, and she immediately loved him and carried him back home with her to raise him as her very own. Well, God still wasn't left out of the picture on this, because we know that by, again, his providence, whenever she went to look for a nursemaid to raise up baby Moses, she chose no one other than Moses' own mother. And so Moses had a very unique and special experience in life. He was brought up in the very lap of luxury. There was nothing he could have ever wanted, nothing he could have ever desired, nothing that he could have ever thought about that he couldn't have, because he was, after all, living in Pharaoh's household. But on the other hand, he was brought up by his mother, who was a Hebrew, and she taught him about his Hebrew heritage. She taught him about God. She taught him about his service to God. And so Moses had the information that he needed and a very great decision that he had to make. And I think that we find it very interesting whenever we consider Moses, and also we find it a wonderful thing that in the end Moses chose to cast in his lot with the Hebrew children and to be one of God's people. In fact, Stephen tells us, whenever he is making what is called Stephen's great apology in Acts the 7th chapter, beginning with verse 23, these things about Moses. He says that whenever he was a full 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. And seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended him and avenged him that was oppressed, and smote the Egyptian. For he supposed his brethren would have understood how that God by his hand would deliver them, but they understood not. And the next day he showed himself unto them as they strove, and would have set them at one again, saying, Sirs, ye are brethren, why do you wrong one another? But he that did his neighbor wrong thrust him away, saying, Who made thee a ruler or a judge over us? Wilt thou kill me, as thou didst the Egyptian yesterday? Then fled Moses at this saying, and was a stranger in the land of Midian, where he begat 2 sons. And when 40 years were expired, there appeared unto him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai an angel of the Lord in a flame of fire in the bush. Now this is where we picked up our story, and so we have a pretty good idea of what Moses' life was like. He spent the first 40 years of his life living in Pharaoh's household. He spent the next 40 years of his life living in Midian under the influence of his father-in-law, who was a priest. He learned some about God, but obviously not everything that he needed to know. And now we find that for the next 40 years, the last 40 years of his life, he has been chosen by God to deliver his people out of Egyptian bondage. But you know, whenever we get to this story, we find that Moses was approached by God, and the scriptures that we read said that when God saw that Moses turned to him, when God saw that Moses was interested in this burning bush, then God chose to communicate with him. So I want to start out this morning by just reminding you how important it is that we love the Lord, how important it is that we love right, how important it is that we want to go to heaven. And I am thoroughly and totally convinced this morning that I'm addressing a group of people that feel just that way. I've heard about you before I ever got here. I've talked to Doug about coming here and others that have been here. And so I just want you to know that your reputation precedes you as a congregation of people, as a community of people that love the Lord, that love the church, and that want to serve him in the very best way that they can. Well, that's kind of the way that Moses finds himself here. But whenever he approaches God, he gets a very special instruction, because the angel of the Lord told him, you stop where you are, Moses. You take off your shoes, because the ground that you're standing on is holy ground. Now I want to remind you that this ground was not holy because there was a temple there. It wasn't holy because God had at some predetermined time decreed that this would be a holy place where there would be a temple built. It wasn't holy for any other reason except the fact that this is the place that God chose to communicate with Moses. In any place where we find God communicating with his people, any place where we find God, period, is a holy place. You know, whenever we see this, certainly we understand that Moses recognized the importance of it. For it says in verse 6, he hid his face for he was afraid to look upon God. And as I understand that, whenever Moses realized where he was, he prostrated himself upon the ground. There he covered his face to hear what God had to say. He reverenced God. He honored God. He showed his respect for that. We know you and I need to realize today that we're on holy ground. And what I mean by that is as the church gathered together in the presence of God, you and I are as close to heaven as we'll ever get on this side of eternity. You and I today should recognize the reverence and the holiness of this place of worship. And in fact, we would be doing such a great injustice if we didn't realize that the Lord himself is here. Jesus said in Matthew 18 and verse 20, for where there are 2 or 3 gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them. So whenever we come together as the church, Jesus is here. Now, make no mistake, he wasn't called on to lead a song. He wasn't called on to deliver the lesson this morning. He's not here where you can see him, and he won't be the one leading the dismissal prayer. But also make sure that we understand that if Jesus is not here, then you and I might as well go home. In fact, the Bible doesn't promise us that Jesus will be in places where people don't reverence him. It doesn't give us the assurance that he'll be in places where we don't obey his word. But he says that where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there will I be in the midst of them. You know, that's an important concept, and it's a very important topic. In fact, it's so important that Paul wrote to Timothy so long ago in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 14 and 15, these things write I unto thee, hoping to come unto thee shortly. But if I tarry long, that thou mayest know how thou oughtest to behave thyself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and the ground of truth. Now, of course, the Apostle Paul was primarily instructing Timothy how that the church should be set in order with deacons and with elders, how that worship should be conducted, how that the table should be set, how that the services should proceed. But it included more than that as well. It included how we treat each other. It included how we our attitude toward God. It included not only that, but our reputation in the community and the way that we reverence God. It's an important thing that you and I recognize as the church how we ought to behave ourselves. In fact, we can find throughout the New Testament that there are people that love God, people that wanted to serve God, and just like you and me today, people that wanted to go to heaven. But because of our human nature and sometimes because of our busy and helter-skelter lives, they would forget how they ought to behave themselves in the church. And the apostles would have to write to them, to instruct them. Those writings have been left to us so that we can see our attitude and how we ought to behave ourselves in the church. But sometimes we forget as they did. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 17, the Apostle Paul writes this, now in this that I declare unto you, I praise you not, that you come together not for the better, but for the worse. Now how awful would that be that whenever you and I came together, whenever we went through our worship, whenever we went through our association together, whenever everything was said and done and we went home, God in heaven sat back and said, I wish they hadn't come together today. I wish they hadn't done that. They're worse off now than they were before they came together. Well, certainly we want to avoid that, and certainly we want to do those things that are pleasing in God's sight. And so we welcome the instructions of the apostles, and we welcome what they have to say. In fact, following up on this idea that the Apostle Paul had in 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and verse 40, he says, let all things be done decently and in order. And so you and I strive to do that. You and I strive to serve God in a way that our lives will be decently in order, but also whenever we come together, that our assembling would be decently in order. But you know, I find that sometimes, just like the Christians of old, we forget about some of those things. Sometimes we become just a little too relaxed. Sometimes we become just a little too casual in our services, and just like Christians of all ages and God's people of all ages, we need to be reminded about those things. And so for just a little while this morning, I want to talk about some of those things that I think we sometimes fall down on. Some of those things that we leave lacking. Maybe it is that we've never thought about it much, maybe we've never given it much consideration, but remember that God in heaven has a standard that He holds us to, and it behooves us to know that standard and to know what He'd have us to do so that we can be pleased in Him. We all want to go to heaven, every one of us. We got up this morning, we went ahead and took care of whatever we had to take care of. We went ahead and got ready, and we came out to worship this morning for one reason. We want to show our reverence and our love for God, and we want to go to heaven. And so this morning, sometimes we need to ask ourselves, are there some things I could do better? Are there some things that I'm falling behind on? You know, whenever I stop and look, I think one of the first things that you and I can do whenever we assemble on the first day of the week is to make sure that we are ready to worship. And whenever I say ready to worship, I mean that we are ready both physically for worship and mentally for worship. And you say, well, how can I possibly be ready physically for worship? Well, you know, I find that in many places that I go, people forget to take care of basic needs before the services begin. And what I mean by that is to get a drink of water and go to the restroom. They're not physically prepared. And so throughout the entire service, people are going back and forth to the restroom, back and forth to get a drink of water in and out of the building. And perhaps they've never thought about that, the effect that it has on other people and other worshipers. If they did, I'm sure that they wouldn't do that. And so whenever you and I get up to spend on the Lord's Day morning, it's a time for us to get physically prepared to worship. And whenever we do that, also we have to realize that we have some responsibilities to God in that order. We need to be dressed our very best whenever we come to worship. And I can remember, and you can too, whenever that was an item of high priority to people, that they would put on their best clothes, that they would prepare themselves their very best, so that they would be ready for worship. In Exodus chapter 19 and verse 10, here Moses speaks to the people, or rather the Lord speaks to Moses, and then He speaks to the people. And the Lord said unto Moses, go unto the people and sanctify them today and tomorrow. Listen to this. And let them wash their clothes. Have you ever thought about that? The children of Israel, because of their traveling in the desert, God had made them a promise. Your clothes are never going to wear out, and your shoes are never going to wear out. They wore garments that were prepared by the Lord. So why would the Lord God then say, wash your clothes before you assemble together? Well, it's obvious, and we know why He would say that. He wanted them to have on the very best that they had. He wanted them to be prepared and to know that they were assembling for a special purpose. He wanted them to show Him reverence and honor by wearing the best that He had. You know, for a long time growing up in the church, every time we'd have a gospel meeting, you just couldn't have a gospel meeting unless the preacher preached to the women at least 1 or 2 nights a week, telling them how they ought to dress, what they ought to wear, how they ought to behave themselves. And I want you to just to look around, and sometime, whenever you have a chance to do that, worked pretty good, didn't it? Because whenever you look around the congregation, every woman here is dressed the way that she should be. And every woman here has on her best. And I'm ashamed to say sometimes that some of my gender, some of my folks, we fall behind on that sometimes. We get just a little too casual on that sometimes. And it's something that maybe we ought to give some thought to and give some reverence to whenever we stop and consider our service to God. Think about it along these lines. Suppose you had a job that you had wanted all your life. Maybe you had prepared for that job through training and through living a good life so that people would consider you for that job. And now you finally get the opportunity to go and interview for that job. Is that what you wear is going to make a difference? Sure it does. It absolutely does. Because it shows your prospective employer how seriously you're taking that. And because it shows that you recognize who's in authority. And that you recognize how that you should show reverence to that. And so you'd wear your very best. Suppose you had a good friend or perhaps a family member. Tragically enough, this happens every day. Word comes to you that your good friend or your family member's passed away and that the funeral services are going to be tonight or tomorrow night or they're going to have the visitation. How are you going to dress whenever you go to that? Well, you're going to wear the best that you have. And I want you to notice, I didn't say a three-piece suit. I've never owned but one three-piece suit, and I couldn't get into the best then. I've never owned a $1,000 suit. I've never even owned a $500 suit. I have to do with what I can do, but what I want you to know, God expects us to do what we can do. And so whenever we stop and consider that, sometimes maybe we don't meet the mark. And sometimes whenever we realize that God in heaven above is sitting down watching us, and He's judging our attitude, and He's judging our reverence, and He's really evaluating just how much He really means to us, that might be an area that we could improve on, and perhaps we should give it some thought. Well, another way that we can prepare ourselves for worship is to be prepared spiritually. That means mentally and emotionally to worship. And I'll tell you something that I learned a long time ago, especially whenever my young ones were small in the house. For me and for my family, Sunday morning is a time we just don't need to turn the television on. We just need to make sure that we don't get all ahead of ourselves and run get the newspaper and see what's going on around the world. Because the fact of the matter is, you can't change any of that. You can't make any difference in any of that. What's going on is going to keep going on, and it won't hurt you to wait a few hours to find out about it. It won't hurt you to wait till a little bit later in the day to get involved in it. It should be a time on the Lord's Day morning whenever we take every precaution not to have any kind of conflict or ill words or argument with anybody in our house or anybody anywhere else, because I can promise you that if you allow yourself to get involved in that, whenever you get to worship, it's hard to turn that off, it's hard to get it out of your mind, and it's hard to be prepared to truly worship God in truth and in spirit. And you know, we need to recognize that, and we need to make sure that we do everything that we can to keep ourselves in a quiet frame of mind, an humble frame of mind, so that we can also be ready to worship the God of heaven. You know, it wouldn't be a good idea to get up a little bit early and read a few Bible verses. It wouldn't be a bad idea to get up a little bit early and maybe go outside and stand and just observe some of the beauty of God's world that He's allowed us to live in. Wouldn't be a bad idea to have a little word of prayer with God and ask Him to help us to get ourselves ready for worshiping Him. And I can promise you that if you don't do those things, it'll be harder and harder as time goes on for you to get closer to God. You know, whenever I stop and think about that as well, there's some things that we've allowed to happen and to creep into our worship that really just don't have any place in our worship or in our buildings at all. In fact, what I mean by that, you know, the Bible teaches us that we should train up our children in the way that they should go, and whenever they get grown, they get old, they'll not depart from it. You know, sometimes after services are over, you walk to the back of the building, you allow your eyes to drift left or right very much. You might get the idea that you've been in a place where Toys R Us has had a cyclone come through. Because there'll be coloring books and crayons, dolls and stuffed animals and trucks and cars and all kinds of toys. Now, I realize the purpose of those, and I realize why we do that. Sometimes we kind of get the idea that if we will do something like that to occupy our child's attention, that they will behave better and that they will not interrupt other folks. You know, that's kind of shirking our responsibility. We have a responsibility to train our children, and if we're going to wean them off of toys and all of that stuff in the assembly, when are we going to do that? At what age is that appropriate? And I can tell you that sometimes it's hard to train up our children. Sometimes it's hard to teach them the way that we want to go. But now, I've raised two. I got 5 grandbabies. I've been teaching school for 24 years. Teaching Boy Scouts longer than that. I don't do that anymore. I've been around a lot of kids, and maybe I hope you trust me enough to take my word for it. They can be taught, and they can be trained, and that'll stick with them a lot longer as they learn. Look, whenever we go to the Lord's house, it's a special place. When we go to the Lord's house, it's a time whenever we behave differently. Whenever we go to the Lord's house, there's just not many excuses we can make for misbehaving, and you'd be amazed, you'd be surprised how quickly children will pick up on that and how quickly they'll learn that, and they'll even begin to notice others that don't do that. You know, I read one time in a Dear Abby column that for a person to be habitually late is their way, maybe subconsciously, of showing their disrespect for something. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not, but I can tell you what being habitually late to the worship services can do for you. You know, whenever everybody, especially in a building like this, and it is so wonderful, I want you to know that I noticed this, to see a building that is absolutely full of people. And I hope that we also realize that whenever we don't get up and get ready and get ourselves ready, whenever we don't make sure that we get to the building in time for worship. Now, I'm not talking about the occasional isolated time whenever there's a wreck on the highway, or whenever the train is stopped in the middle of town and we can't get through, whenever there's something that we could not have known about, could not have. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about sometimes whenever we just allow ourselves to get in the habit of getting to the worship service late. And it's kind of like everybody's already in their place. Everybody's already ready. Maybe the singing has already started. Sometimes even the lesson has already started. And suddenly you hear somebody staggering through the pews. Excuse me. I'm late. I'm late today. Didn't mean to be late. Really and truly. Now this will be rude. I don't know of any preacher that would do this. I wouldn't do this. But really and truly, when that starts going on, you'd be better off just to stop and wait on that person to get into their seat so that everybody could once again return to the frame of worship and worship God in truth and spirit. But sometimes we don't think about those things. We get too involved in what we've got going on. We get too involved in the world that we live in. We get so involved in the things that occupy our time outside of our service to God that we can't make the distinction. We can't make the distinction of when we're serving God and when we're serving ourselves, when we're serving our job. And along those lines, there are a lot of things that you and I just need to be careful about. Have you had a fire alarm go off in your building yet? I want to tell you about one that happened to me. I was up preaching. Those of you that give lessons know what I'm talking about. Things were going well with my sermon, and I was kind of in a rhythm. And all of a sudden, right about the middle of the building, right about there, bee-boo, 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 some guy had brought in a fire walkie-talkie. And he was sitting there monitoring that thing, but he didn't have it turned to where everybody else couldn't hear it. So right in the middle of the sermon, it comes on and says, Unit 1 to Unit 2, all units involved, and begins to give instructions how to get to the place where the fire is, calls the people's name out, whose house is on fire, tells where it's at. And you know where everybody was looking? Right at me, right? Oh, no. Everybody's turning looking at that. You know why? That's their neighbor. That's somebody they know. That's a place they know. And now they're wondering what all's going on over there. They're wondering how bad that is. And those are all things we should be concerned with after we finish worshiping and after the service is over. That brother, whenever that thing went off, he threw it right straight up in the air like it was a hot potato, and he juggled it for a while before he ever got control of it. Everybody's watching him. Everybody's wondering what's going on. He finally got it turned off or unplugged or whatever he did to it. And you know what? Again, I don't know of any preacher would do it. I wouldn't do it. But I would have been just as well off, shut my Bible, folded up my notes, gone and sat down, and us tried to get through with the communion service and go on and let everybody worry about what was going on. Because nobody was interested in my sermon anymore. Nobody was interested in anything I had to say anymore. And I can understand that, but I don't know that God does. And so those things are better off left at home. Now, it's not so much the red fire walkie-talkies we have to worry about anymore. It's these little black boxes that we carry around with us that we just can't live without. You know what I'm talking about? Y'all had a cell phone go off in your assembly lately? Y'all had that go on? You know, I guess that we just might as well accept the fact that cell phones and electronic communications, they call them devices in most places, they're here to stay. They're not anybody going to take them up. They're not anybody going to ban them because of all the problems they cause. And they do cause problems. They cause problems on the highway. They cause problems in schools. You know, that's another thing. They ought not be causing problems in the Lord's house during worship. I've had those things go off in the middle of services, and you know, it's amazing some of the ringtones that people have. You wonder if that's some kind of phone they found somewhere, or maybe somebody else got a hold of it and did something to it, because some of the ringtones that come through those things would not denote that they were Christians at all anyway. And you know, I've heard those things go off and just ruin the service before. You know what I'm talking about, and I want to commend you on this. that I just like this personally. I can't help but think it doesn't enhance the service. When everybody gets in, finds a seat, and just for a minute or so, everything is quiet and calm. Everybody can get their mind tuned into worship before we actually start our worship. Well, I went to a gospel meeting once, and we had to travel a couple hours to get there. And so it was just like that. Everybody was sitting, and I was sitting right there. And just right before, in fact, the brother that was going to lead the first song had already started up out of his seat, and one of those wild ringtones went off, and it was one of our older brethren. And he picked that thing up, and he punched some buttons on it, and then he said, yeah, it's me, yeah. No, I don't know what happened to her. She just up and died, that's all I know. No, they're not going to have a funeral, nothing like that. I don't know why they're going to cremate her. That's what they're going to do. They're just going to cremate her. Yeah, well, if I find out anything else, I'll let you know. I'm not exaggerating that, folks. That's exactly the conversation that went on. Now, my question is this. How ready was anybody to worship after that? How ready? How much was their mind in tune to that? Some folks was laughing. Some folks was frowning. I was nearly crying because I know that service is ruined. And I could just imagine, I wasn't preaching that night, but I could just imagine if I had been, what would I have done? Now, the last one that happened, and I don't have any notes on this, because I preached this sermon everywhere I've been. And up until now, I guess it's done me good. Last week, I was in a place, I'm going to tell you where it is. Brother was up leading a psalm, had that thing on like it was a six-shooter, ready to draw it out as soon as he could, and it went off. First thing he done is tried to hit it, I guess, to kill it. That didn't work. So then the next thing he did, right there in the middle of the second verse of the psalm, he's singing with the book in this hand, he's got that thing out in this hand, and he's, well, I know that, he went ahead and tried to get through with that. And then whenever he started to walk down the aisle to his seat, he said, I apologize for that, folks. Well, he didn't apologize to me. What I think really doesn't matter. How happy I am really doesn't matter. And some of my opinions don't really matter. I tell you who you need to apologize to. You need to apologize to God, because he just took it on himself to come in and single-handedly ruin a worship service because of something that he couldn't control. Leave them in the car. Don't bring them in the building. You bring it in the building, you're going to forget to turn it off. You bring it in the building, you've got it on vibrate. It's going to vibrate, and you're just going to die to know what's on it before you can stand it. You're going to have that thing out kind of sneaking it along. Leave it in the building, or leave it in the car. It has no business in the building. You know, it doesn't hurt us to talk a little bit and visit whenever we get outside. I've had people before, whenever I give this little lesson, they'd come up and say, I've got the Bible out. So, in other words, that's what I had my phone out for the whole time service was going on. I was actually reading the Bible. Now you falsely accuse me. But I stand up here and y'all sit back there, and I can see everybody's face. And I've seen people reading the Bible out, just bust out and die laughing about something. And just grin from ear to ear. And just have the biggest time you've ever seen. Now, excuse me, folks. I've read the book version of the Bible. It ain't that funny. And so when you're sitting back there, grinning, punching, looking over at some, I have a hard time believing that's the Bible out. But even if it is, it'd be better off you put that up. Get you out a real Bible. There's plenty of them laying on these pews. I've already looked. And the reason that that'd be better is because you don't give some younger person that might be looking up to you as an example or reason to think it's all right for you to play with your phone. Incidentally, those same people that are looking at the Bible app can tell you before you ever get to the end of the vestibule back there who won in whatever ball game was going on, what somebody else had to say. And here's something that just bothers me. It just does. If there's a preacher on the East Coast that misquotes a scripture, these people in the West Coast know about it before the service is even over. These little old social media apps that we play with, can't live without, got to know what's going on, have already caused some of the biggest problems in congregations that I've ever seen. And we need to learn to get a grip on that and get a hold of that. Everybody doesn't need to know what you think. And whenever we get on social media and we hide behind the anonymity that goes with that, it's something we'd be better off without, and the church would be better off without, but absolutely it'd be better off if we exercise more self-discipline in that than what we do. You know, we find that the Apostle Paul talks about that, and in 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and verse 3, he's talking about how things ought to go on. He says, "He that prophesies speaketh unto men to edification and exhortation and comfort." And so whenever we speak to other people, whenever we talk to other people, whenever we use social media, whenever we do all of that, it ought to be for something good instead of something bad. You know, I hope that it's this way at this congregation. This is the first time I've got to be here, but again, I have no reason to think it wouldn't be. That young people are looking forward to the opportunity whenever they can participate in service. Now, for some of you that travel to gospel meetings, and I know Doug would agree with me on this, for a long time, whenever we was young, we'd try to get to a gospel meeting early. Why? Well, because if we got there early enough, somebody might call on us to lead a song. Somebody might use us. No, what a wonderful experience it was. What a great blessing the first time somebody thought enough of you to ask you to lead a song. And I hope that you young people here feel the same way. I hope that you're interested in learning to sing. I hope that you're interested in participating in that and being a part of that. But I also hope you understand that it's a great responsibility. And what I mean by that is I have heard some wonderful gospel sermons ruined. As my daddy used to say, all the air let out of them by the invitation song. What do you mean by that? No, on Sunday morning I've heard some wonderful gospel sermons. I know some people had to be contemplating obeying the gospel. Some people had to be contemplating making a confession of fault. And the brother get up and lead the invitation song, "Oh, Why Not Tonight?" Now, if that happens, I wonder what the people are thinking about. Should we wait till tonight? Or are we talking about something that might happen tonight? Or is it that that brother did not pay enough attention or care enough to even know whether it was day or night? And I'm not saying those things to be funny. I'm not saying it to be comical. I just want you to know that we have a responsibility whenever we take part in worship. And yes, it is a wonderful blessing whenever people think enough of us to call on us. It is a wonderful blessing whenever people recognize that we have worked to develop the ability to do that. But there is also some responsibilities to those things. And we need to be careful about that and understand. One part of our worship is prayer. And I want to commend the prayer that was prayed today. I'm sure that just like you, I remember some of the things that were talked about. I can tell you that I remember Marcus talking about the election that's coming up. I don't care too much for politics, but that's carrying a lot of importance in our country today. He talked about people that were sick. He talked about and asked God to bless those that were sick, standing in need. He asked parents to have the blessings of God to bring up their children. And everything that he said I could understand. And I think that he did a wonderful job on that. And that's why I'm feel free and good about talking about it. Do you know, have you ever had somebody that whenever they would pray, it'd get so long that you just couldn't stay with it? And you'd feel guilty because you couldn't stay with it. I thank the Lord whenever his disciples came to him in Matthew chapter 6, and they said, "Lord, teach us how to pray." Now, we've noticed John taught his disciples how to pray. We're just not really all that comfortable with that. Lord, teach us how to pray. And whenever Jesus gave the model prayer, "Thy Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come," whenever he gave that model prayer, what he was showing was the things that were important to God to hear about. But if you'll notice, you can read through that prayer in just about a minute or less. Now, I'm not at all saying that we should quit praying out from our heart. I'm not at all saying that we should try to shorten our prayers to where they're not effective. But sometimes we need to recognize that our public prayers are different than our private prayers, and that we are praying on behalf of the entire congregation, and that the things that we say should be applicable to the whole congregation, and those things that are personal to us, those things that are just things we talk to God about, we can talk to him about that tonight or after the service is over. You know, concerning prayer, I just got to say this is something that bothers me. As a young man, and I'll go ahead and tell you this, I wasn't brought up in the church. I didn't obey the gospel until I was in my teens. And it was the most wonderful thing, because I had looked for the truth for years before I ever found it. Whenever I found the truth, I can't tell you how excited I was about that, and how excited I am even today about that. But one of the things that impressed me the most as I began to attend the services of the Church of Christ, every male member in the building got down on their knees to pray. And some of you are nodding your head. You remember that too, don't you? In fact, that was something that impressed me so much. I asked my father-in-law, "You think that's important? People get down on their knees and pray?" And he said, "With what God has done for me, that's the least I can do." Now, you know, it is something that we ought to give more thought to. It's something that is important. In fact, in Isaiah chapter 45, verse 23, here God speaking through Isaiah says, "I have sworn by myself, the word has gone out of my mouth in righteousness, and shall not return, that unto me every knee shall bow, and every tongue shall swear." What's that? The Lord said, "In the by and by, before all this is over, folks, you will get on your knees before me." In Romans chapter 14 and verse 11, Paul says, "For it is written, as I live, saith the Lord, every knee shall bow unto me, and every tongue shall confess to God." That's just Paul's way of quoting the verse before that. In Philippians chapter 2 and verse 10, here again the Apostle Paul says, "In the name of Jesus, every knee should bow, of things in heaven, of things in earth, and things under the earth." Let me tell you something that happened to me that really brought this home to me. I got to notice in myself, whenever I'd go to bed at night, I would go with the intention of laying there in my bed and making my prayers to God. You ever do that? And then here's what would happen. I would get about halfway through my prayer, and I'd doze off. Now, sometimes I'd wake back up, and I even caught myself doing it. I'm sorry, Lord, I'm sorry. And then start over. And sometimes I wouldn't wake up at all. And I got kind of thinking about that. That's one of the rudest things that you could possibly do to another person. I want you to know that I have come to grown to love this congregation in the last 2 days that I've been here. I love this part of the country. I don't get to see it enough. I love each and every one of you. I really do. But whenever we are standing outside, or whenever we go up to the shelter to eat in a little bit, if you walk up to talk to me and I walk up to talk to you, and right in the middle of one of your sentences you go to sleep, I'll probably stand there for a little bit. Maybe I would think that you had narcolepsy or something and you couldn't help it. But you do it the second time, I'm going to go on off and talk to somebody else. You think God feels any different than that? You think that he deserves any less reverence for that? So here's what I made up my mind that I was going to do. And this is what I do. And I'm not saying that it's right because I do it. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm just saying this works for me. I get on my knees every time I pray to God. At night at home and in the services. And you know what? I've never gone to sleep while I did that. I've been able to stay more in tune to what the brother was praying, more in tune to what I was saying, and it shows a reverence to God that I'm really proud of. You know what I've noticed too? I've noticed that since I started doing that, and I did mention it in a sermon, others in my congregation are now getting on their knees whenever they pray. And I'm glad of that. Now, my son's 37 years old, but he started doing that. You know what? His little boy's going to do that too. And some of the other younger kids in the assembly are going to do that too. And you know why? Because they mimic what their leaders do. They mimic what granddaddy does. They mimic what their daddy does. They mimic what other members of the church. I can remember an old farmer, he's passed away now, that worshiped with us. He was about 6'5", and he sat hunkered up over that combine all week, or a cotton picker. He was stiff in the joints, and it was rough on him to move around sometimes. He sat right there. He'd get up out of his chair, out of his pew, and he would unfold himself and get down on his knees and pray. And he's been gone now for a lot of years, and I still remember that. And you know what? If you show your reverence to God, and if you show your sincerity to God, it'll be a positive thing. It may be that you're not a preacher. It may be that you're not a song leader. But I'll guarantee you it'll have a positive impact on the congregation and the people that you're around, and it'll be something that you can contribute with. Well, I'm trying to get finished now. There's another thing that I want to mention. You know, in our communion service, the most important thing that we do, I suppose, in the whole week, we assemble together to worship God. and we assemble together to remember our Lord's death and suffering until he comes again. Now, I hope you hadn't figured this out about me, but I'm just as vain as any other preacher you'll ever run across. What I mean by that is if you want to really be my friend, if you want me to remember you forever, you just come up after services today and tell me how much you enjoyed my sermon. Now, you don't have to mean that, but if you say it, I'll remember you. I'm just that vain. Now, I said all that to make this point. This is not the place to do that. And sometimes we might hear a preacher that we really like. Sometimes we might hear a sermon that's special to us. And whenever we wait on the table, we get up here and we talk about that, and we re-preach that sermon, and we talk about some points that were made that we want to make sure everybody... This is not time for that. This is time to assemble around the Lord's table. This is time for all of our attention to be upon Jesus and on his death and suffering, on him giving his life as a sacrifice to purchase our pardon. I don't want you talking about me up here. No other preacher that I know of wants that. Maybe sometimes we just need reminding of what our responsibility is, and whenever we wait on the table, that we do that earnestly and sincerely. It's not time if I'm sitting here, I don't know what side of the building the cup and the bread will start on, but I'll tell you this, it starts over here. When it finishes over here, I'll still have time to get my money out for the contribution. I won't have to be fumbling around on that. You know, the scriptures teach us to tarry one for another, and that's one thing that we do. We wait on one another. There'll be times that, and the communion is not over until it's over. And so we need to remember that, and that's the way that we show our reverence, and that's the way that we show our sincerity in the things that we do. I'm through today. You know, in John chapter 4, verse 22 to 24, Jesus was talking to the woman that we just referred to as the Samaritan woman at the well. And he told her, you worship you know not what. In other words, you don't know what you're doing. But we know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. Salvation comes through the Church of Christ today, folks. But the hour cometh, and now is, when the true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father seeketh such to worship him. Without that, he won't accept our worship. God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. And I hope that maybe I could have said something today that would help us with that a little bit, and that we can think about in days to come. If you're here this morning and you've not obeyed the gospel, this is the opportunity for you to do that. If you obey the gospel of Christ and become a member of the Church of Christ, the only church you read about in the Bible, the only place where salvation is found, by hearing the Word of God taught, believing with all your heart that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, repenting of your sins, confessing publicly your belief in Jesus as the Christ, submitting to baptism for the remission of sins. So this morning, if it's your desire to do that, it's our desire to assist you. If you're here this morning and have obeyed the gospel, and you have a need for making a public confession of fault, we'll assist you in that also while we stand and while we sing.